Welcome back to my channel for a short Nikon episode. And in this episode, I want to explain why I prefer the Nikon Z8 over the Nikon Z9, although I've shot this camera so often, so many times and successfully in a lot of jobs and shootings. And I want to provide my reasons. You're of course invited to comment in the comment section below the video, and I'm curious what your opinion is. What camera is for you? Is it the Z8 or is it the Z9? Let's kick this off. What I want to do in this video is going through the specifications of both cameras. And I really took the effort to put these specifications for the Nikon Z8 and the Nikon Z9 side by side and going through them line item by line item. So I will provide to you a comprehensive, detailed and absolutely complete overview what you get on the Z9 in contrast or sometimes in addition to the Z8. But the most eye-catching differences we can see by the design of the two camera bodies. And first of all, the Nikon Z9 is much bigger. That is obvious, and the reason is that you shoot this camera easily in horizontal orientation or in landscape mode as well as in portrait mode. And in portrait mode you have here all the buttons, the shutter release button, the control buttons, everything you have you can fully use here in portrait orientation in the same way as you can use it in horizontal orientation of the camera or the landscape mode. And that is a big advantage if you are in fashion and people photography. Because with the Z8, of course, you have to turn it by 90 degrees and then you shoot it like this. No, I don't mind. And that's the reason why when the Z8 came to the market, I considered it carefully. I went through the specification and said, this is the camera I go with for the future. I don't need necessarily that functionality where you have here like a firmly mounted second hand grip in portrait orientation, because I'm used to shooting cameras in portrait orientation and having my hands here just coming from the top and the pointing finger on the shutter release button. So that doesn't irritate me, but for some people this really is a difference. And I realized in some of the fashion shootings I was doing that it plays back if you have the ability to rotate the camera by 90 degrees and get the same functionality in terms of shutter release button and control elements. So that is the main eye-catching difference. Now, because the camera body of the Z9 is bigger, you also have more mechanical control elements. So for instance, on the front side, you have 3 function buttons where you can assign functions in the menu. And you have on the Nikon Z8 only 2 of them here. If you look, there is one and here is the second one. So you miss one. You also have tiny little differences on control wheels. So for instance, here you can actually switch on this control wheel here from single shooting to burst mode and so on. You also have here, if I rotate this, there is a little button here I need to push and then I can rotate it, for instance, to the self timer and so on. So you have some more control elements from a mechanical perspective on a larger camera body. That's obvious. But the control elements I have on the Nikon Z8, they're enough for what I need for my daily shootings. And that's the main reason why I think the compactness factor here on this camera is really superior to more elements and the portrait orientation mode on the Z9. And that's my personal taste, of course. That's something I figured out based on my shooting habits and the workflow I'm following when I do a shooting. There are a couple of more obvious differences if we stay for a moment with the camera body and the design of the cameras and the overall concept of the camera. And the first 2 concern the card slot here. And first of all, the card slot door here on the Nikon Z8 can be pushed easily open. And that can also happen accidentally. And if you open it accidentally, it will just slow down your workflow. So you don't want to have that. On the Nikon Z9, that cannot happen, because you cannot accidentally slide this open. You have to basically push down that lever, then you can open it. And if you close it again, it's closed. No thumb can accidentally open that card slot door. And that is better. In general, the Z9 I think is the slightly more robust camera, although the weather sealing of the 2 cameras is about the same. I didn't find any differences there, but it just feels a bit more solid than the Nikon Z8, maybe also based on the bulky design of the camera body. The second big difference is also in the context of the card slots. If I open the Nikon Z8, I have a compact flash express card slot here, type B, and an SD card slot. And in general, the speed or transfer rate of these two card systems is totally different. Whereas Compact Flash Express is super fast, the SD card is no match in terms of speed, reading and writing for a Compact Flash Express card. And if in the menu I set up these two card slots in a way that I use the backup function, means that all the footage ends simultaneously on both cards, then the SD card becomes my bottleneck and slows me down. So I cannot choose the backup function in the way I did it on the Nikon Z9 in the past. I have to make sure that everything that needs a high transfer rate is ending only at the Compact Flash Express card. Otherwise, the speed advantage of that card will get lost based on the bottleneck of the much slower SD card. And that is something you need to bear in mind. On the Nikon Z9, that's different. The Nikon Z9 actually has both card slots as Compact Flash Express Type B. And here we have now the same speed in terms of writing and reading in terms of transfer rates, and that means I can safely use and configure this in the menu as backup so that all footage ends simultaneously on both cards and there is no bottleneck. It will just work like a charm. That is a big advantage if you work with high resolution video and you shoot very often in high burst mode. The last big disadvantage of the Z8 compared to the Z9 is the battery. So let's get the batteries out. On the Z9 this is down here. And let's do the same on the Z8, and then let's have a look at them side by side. And I don't think it needs a lot of words to see that the battery on the Z8 is almost kind of a joke, at least looking like a joke, compared to the battery, which is huge and massive in the Nikon Z9. And of course, you get many more shots out of this battery than out of this battery, but this battery is still good enough for, I think, 500 shots if you don't use the LCD too much, and for me that's good enough. I have always spare batteries with me and I can live with that battery setup. So for me the compactness factor really counts, despite the two main disadvantages, namely the card slots and the battery, plus some design features with more control elements here on the Z9 compared to the Z8, and that compartment door here for the card slots, which can accidentally open, which cannot happen on the Nikon Z9. And then of course, last but not least, accepting that on a Z8 I have to shoot portrait orientation in this way and holding the camera from the top, whereas here I can conveniently rotate it by 90 degrees and have all the control elements at my disposal. Let's now go through the specifications, because I want to show you that there are only minor differences in all the rest of the specifications you want to look into for the Nikon Z8 and the Nikon Z9. And by the way, Nikon has a great track record in firmware updates. So when the Z8 came to market, it looked kind of a little bit superior in terms of capabilities to the Nikon Z9. Then the Nikon Z9 firmware update hit the market, and then the Z9 was a bit superior, only a tiny little bit in my opinion. And now we just got recently a new firmware for the Nikon Z8, and that again lifts up the standard and the capabilities for the Z8. So in terms of shooting capabilities, you kind of get the same. There are minor differences. I don't think they are worthwhile in the way I will show it in a moment when we go through these specifications. It's really the design factor, the batteries, the card slots, and the portrait orientation on the Nikon Z9 that matters and make the true differences of these two camera bodies. Alright, let's get right into it. On the left hand side, you will always see now the specifications for the Nikon Z8. On the right hand side, you will see the specifications for the Nikon Z9. And it's a few weeks back that I took these screenshots, and Nikon is providing regularly firmware updates. So tiny little things might have changed here and there, improvements by firmware rollout. But at the end of the video, I will quickly show the most recent firmware of the Z8 and the Z9, and again, compare them quickly so you will get a complete picture of what's going on here. The first difference we see here is in the price tag in the upper left hand side corner. So the Z8 comes for $4,000 recommended retail price, and the Nikon Z9 for $5,500. So the Z9 is significantly more expensive. Then on this page here, the only difference I see is that the Z8 resolution in the DX format is slightly lower. That's basically all we have to note here. On the next page of specifications, the Z8 provides more formats for still images. That was some weeks back. Since the Z9 is catching up all the time, and then the Z8 is catching up again with firmware updates, that might have changed. It's anyway not something that moves the needle if you compare these two cameras. Next page on the specifications, we talked about that already. The Z9 clearly is superior from a storage perspective, because you have these super fast Compact Flash Express Type B cards, whereas on the left hand side on the Z8 you only have one Compact Flash card slot and one SD card slot. That means the backup function storing everything simultaneously on both cards will not work, at least not for me, if you have high resolution images, high resolution video and you shoot in burst mode. Next page, no differences at all. We have the same electronic viewfinder, we have the same shutter, and by the way, we also have the same sensor, we have the same resolution, and we also have exactly the same mechanism that only electronic shutter is available, and the readout time of the sensor is super fast. There will be no rolling shutter effects with the Z8 as well as with the Z9. Next page, empty, no differences when it comes to exposure. Then sensitivity, exactly the same. The ISO range is the same. Both cameras offer the same range. And the only difference, if you want to point it out, but I didn't frame it here with a red line, is on active delighting. There is extra high 1 on both cameras and the Z8 has extra high. I guess that's by now also in the Z9 by firmware update, because there should basically be no reason why any of these features is only in one or the other camera. Next page, some differences. So the detection range in terms of autofocus for the Z8 is -7 to +19 exposure values. On the Z9, it's -6.5 to 19 exposure values. Nothing that really creates a difference here. And on the autofocus specs in general, they look slightly different, but the Z8 and the Z9 have essentially the same absolutely gorgeous autofocus system. And as I said before, the firmware updates provide permanent improvements on autofocus tracking, on subject detection, and all these type of features you want to have, in particular if you go for sports and action. Next page, only on the accessory shoe, some difference I noted here. We have ISO 518 hot shoe on the Z8 and an ISO 519 sync terminal with looking thread, and that is of course a tiny little bit better, but again doesn't move the needle. Next page on white balance, no differences at all. This is exactly the same. We have essentially the same video functions, but both cameras will get continuous improvements. I'm repeating myself, and from time to time you spot a little bit of a difference in terms of one or the other resolution being available on one or the other camera. But again, nothing to write home about. Next page, absolutely empty. Movie active delighting is the same. Time coding is the same. The log gamma output is the same, and so on and so on. Same features, nothing to spot here in terms of differences. On playback, we have more features on the Z8, and I don't think it's necessary to go into it, but I have shot the Z9 such a long time, so many times in shootings, enjoyed it. I never missed anything on the playback functions, so also here I think both cameras are essentially at par. On the connection, there is a true difference here, because the Z9 has an Ethernet jack and that's not available on the Z8. So if you are a studio photographer and you need that for wiring up your camera with your computer or, you know, with your network, then this is something which you will miss on the Z8. And on GPS, we also have this on the Z8, only via a smartphone connection, whereas on the Z9, it's a built-in GPS, which is then working standalone without any connection to the smartphone. So you will always have the coordinates of your shooting location in a meta file of your image. Then on the next page, we talked about batteries already. The battery of the Z9 is way off superior, much larger capacity, much more shots you can squeeze out of that larger battery. And on, you know, additional accessories, maybe worthwhile here to mention that for the Z8, actually you can purchase extension by a battery hand grip, and that will also extend your battery life. It will also give you the portrait mode shooting experience with a dedicated shutter button, dedicated control buttons, and if you want, you can in this way transform the Z8 almost into a Z9. Next page, miscellaneous. We have the dimensions. Of course, the Z9, as you saw before, is much larger, and that's also reflected in the weight. The Z9 has a weight of 1,340 grams, and the Z8 comes in with only 910 grams. So if you want to travel more lightweight, and compactness was one of my decision criteria, why I said I prefer the Z8, then the Z8 is the camera you will prefer here. And here's the hand grip. I wanted to quickly show it. You can purchase it from Nikon. It's a good hand grip. You see you have the dedicated buttons here. If you want, that turns the Z8 in kind of a Z9. That's it in terms of the comparison. Let's continue with the video, because I wanted to show you the newest features of the Z9 and the Z8 very quickly, and then I will wrap up this video. And I hope you have then enough arguments to decide yourself what camera is for you. Is it the Z8 or is it the Z9? I did a bit of research into the newest firmware updates for the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z8 as promised earlier in the video. in order to round up the image I want to provide here when comparing these two absolutely fantastic camera bodies. Nikon speaks here on the website about supercharging your Z9, and that's not an empty promise, no empty words. There are really powerful new features which came to the Nikon Z9 via firmware update 5.00. And remember that photo model here, it will get bigger in terms of images below there on the website. Let me quickly go there. Here we go. Remember that face when I switch to the Nikon Z8 in a moment. And here we go. This is the Nikon Z8 firmware update 2.00, and by now it's 2.01. They already released another firmware between February 7, when 2.00 came out, and today. And if you scroll down here a little bit, we find auto capture function. That enables automatic shooting when the subject meets one or more pre-configured criteria, providing users with new options for both still and video shooting. It's an absolutely fantastic feature. I don't want to go into details here, but it's probably worth a separate video. And if we go back to the Nikon Z9, auto capture is the main big thing coming with firmware 5.00. You see here, auto capture, optimized for next level action. And the Nikon Z9 as a dedicated sports and action camera is always a little bit ahead of the Nikon Z8, although the Nikon Z8 seems to get most, if not all, of the functions and features of the Nikon Z9 over time. And as I said, the compactness factor for me is important, so I don't mind if the Nikon Z8 is even in the future lagging a little bit behind in terms of sports and action photography when I compare it with the Nikon Z9. And remember what I said when we looked into this photo model here. This is the one for the Nikon Z9, and here we have now the same for the Nikon Z8. That's the same photo model, right? So the Nikon Z8 is over time catching up with the Z9, but the Z9 seems to be always one step ahead as a sports and action camera. And that's something you need to consider if you compare these two cameras. If you want the top all-rounder camera, the Z8 is definitely good enough. If you want to have the last quantum of performance in sports and action, you are very likely better advised with the Nikon Z9. But for me, that's not moving the needle enough to accept that bulky large camera body I was actually loving and shooting for a longer time. But with the Nikon Z8, it changed the game for me, and now I prefer the Nikon Z8. Alright, this is all I wanted to show and discuss here, and I hope this was a useful side-by-side comparison for you to come to your own conclusions. Which one do you like more, the Z8 or the Z9? And please drop me a comment on that and let me know your opinion and also your shooting preferences here. And for me, the compactness factor clearly is a big plus. I like that a lot, and I'm okay for my personal taste, my personal workflow, to actually drop some of the big advantages of the Z9, namely the portrait orientation shooting, the much larger battery, and the much better concept of card slots. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there is always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.